So in second grade, students are asked to collect data in groups, find information from texts, and then write an essay. This is supposed to be student directed and led and not teacher directed. In a face-to-face classroom, that's how it would be. So I tried to replicate that virtually. So this is how I did it. First, I made groups. I had a couple different groups in my class. One group A, or they both had facilitators who were the people who led the meeting, who maybe called on kids, make sure people were taking turns. They would share their screen to the text. The reporter would come back to me in the large group and tell me what they discussed. The fact checkers, they were responsible for making sure that the answers were from the text, that they had evidence from the text that supported their answers, which is one of our learning targets. And then if I scroll down a little bit, there are readers in each group, and those are obviously the strong readers in the class. And then I wanted to make sure everybody's name was on this list somewhere so everybody felt important. So there's participators who I told them their job was to make sure they were talking and participating in the group session and giving their input. And I told the facilitators to make sure they called on them. So each job has at least 2 people though, because you never know virtual school who's going to have their screen on, whose technology is going to fail, who's going to participate when you're not looking, those kind of things. So I wanted to make sure that all the bases were covered. The facilitators were obviously strong leaders in the class who had no problem speaking out. The reporters were just really good students who always paid attention, always listened, and would have some idea what was going on in the group so that they could talk to me afterwards. So everybody's job was really well thought out beforehand. So then the facilitator would go, when they go into their group, the facilitator would go into Schoology, and they would only see one of these groups. So you see 2 groups are showing here, but only one would be seen by each group. Also, the other things in that folder would be turned off just so it's a little less confusion. So right now, only the reading groups are showing. So then they would click on their reading group, and then they would see the text. So the reader would obviously read the text. And if all the readers were absent that day and nobody could read the page, which would be very unusual if absolutely nobody could, but if the reading material was too much of a struggle, then I read it in this YouTube link and the facilitator could click on that and it would be me reading the text. So they didn't really need that too much, so I was glad for that. So they would read the text, and then underneath it, well, for this one, they had to also make a scientific drawing in their group too, but underneath it would be the workbook pages that they were filling out. And I purposely didn't put this as a Schoology assessment because I wanted them to have their information at their fingertips for when the test came, which is their written essays. So I wanted it to be available. So a lot of times their work is put on Schoology and I grade it from there, but I was afraid if I put it in Schoology they wouldn't have access to it later, so I wanted to make sure they had access to it. So in this assignment they had to write down what their pollinator was, why that pollinator is attracted to flowers, how pollen sticks to it or what special body parts allow for pollination, and then how does it go to the next flower. So they had to get that from the text, and then if you scroll down they had to draw a scientific drawing of their pollinator. So I had the workbook pages in there so that the facilitators could refer to them as they're going through their lesson. They could say, okay, everybody, let's write down our pollinator, either a beetle or a butterfly, whatever I assigned to them. And then they could say, now, number 1, we have to find out why this pollinator is attracted to flowers. Now, we had already modeled this previously. So the facilitators did know what all this meant. They weren't going into it without having a large group model and not knowing what they were doing. So I even, when we first started going into groups, I pretended it was a large group, small group. So I was like the facilitator, and I acted like I was showing my screen and where they would get their information. So it was all done very methodically. So they could go back then to the pages they needed. I told them to reread it as many times as they needed to. And then, of course, the picture that they needed for their scientific drawing was included in that folder. So, yeah, they did really, really good. It wasn't perfect, but I was really happy with the outcome, and it just proved to me how much you could do virtually and make a virtual classroom very similar to a face-to-face one.